Hi, I'm Sohail. Today I'm going to talk about structure and composition of the cell membrane. In this lecture I'm going to focus on the composition of the cell membrane, fluid mosaic model and functions of the cell membrane. Every cell, that is either prokaryotic cell or eukaryotic cell, that is surrounded by a plasma membrane. Like prokaryotes, as in bacteria, and eukaryotic cells, that is animal cell and plant cell, they have a cell membrane. And cell membrane is also known as plasma membrane, biological membrane or plasma. Cell membrane is extremely thin and delicate structure ranging from 6 to 10 nanometer in thickness. Eukaryotic cells are characterized by numerous organelles, little organs which are present in the cell. They are surrounded by membranes. Some of these organelles, including the nuclear envelope, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi complex, lysosomes, vesicles, vacuoles, they form endomembrane system. And non-membranous organelles are also present in a cell. And these non-membranous organelles are ribosomes, centrosomes, centrioles and cytoskeleton. Cell membrane is composed of protein, lipid and carbohydrate, but the proportion in plasma membrane that differ with cell type. For a typical human cell, protein accounts for about 50% of the composition by mass, lipids accounts for 40%, and carbohydrates comprise the remaining 10%. Plasma membrane, it controls the passage of organic molecules, ions, water and oxygen into and out of the cell. Plasma membrane, it is the boundary between the cell cytoplasm and the surrounding environment. Cell membrane is composed of phospholipids, proteins, cholesterol, glycoproteins and glycolipids. A phospholipid is a lipid molecule with 2 fatty acid chains and a phosphate-containing group. So, a phospholipid, it consists of a glycerol molecule, phosphate group and 2 fatty acid chains. The phosphate group is negatively charged polar hat, which is hydrophilic in nature, and the fatty acid chains are uncharged non-polar tails which are hydrophobic in nature. So, fatty acid chains, they are uncharged hydrophobic tails and the head is hydrophilic in nature because the phosphate group is negatively charged. In phospholipid molecule, a hydrophilic head which is attracted to water but not to lipids, and hydrophobic tail which is repelled by water but mixes readily with lipids. A phospholipid bilayer with embedded proteins that separates the internal contents of the cell, that is cytoplasm, from its surrounding environment. One layer of phospholipid with its hydrophilic heads pointing inward. So, this is one layer of phospholipid molecules and the hydrophilic head is pointing inward. The other layer of phospholipid with its hydrophilic heads are pointing outward. So, this is the second layer where the hydrophilic heads are pointing outward and here the hydrophilic heads are pointing inward. The hydrophilic tails of both phospholipid layers, they are pointing into the center of the membrane, and lipid soluble material that moves through the membrane via phospholipid bilayer. Cell membrane, that is also known as phospholipid bilayer because the phospholipids, it form 2 distinct layers and in each layer the phospholipid molecules, they are arranged. So, the heads are on the surface and the tails are inside. Dissolved ions and water soluble compounds, they cannot cross the lipid portion of plasma membrane because the lipid tails that will not associate with water molecules. This feature makes the membrane very effective in isolating the cytoplasm from the surrounding environment. So, the contents which are present inside the cell membrane, that is the cytoplasm, its composition is very distinct from the surrounding environment. Such isolation is important because the composition of the cytoplasm is very different from that of extracellular fluid. Phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane that is arranged more regular than the random pattern of proteins. There are two types of proteins which are present in the cell membrane, that is extrinsic protein and intrinsic protein. Extrinsic protein is also known as peripheral protein and intrinsic protein is known as integral protein. Extrinsic protein or peripheral protein that is present on both surfaces of bilayer but never extend completely across it. So, this is intrinsic protein. Extrinsic protein is present either in the inner layer or maybe in the outer layer, but it never extend completely across it. So, peripheral proteins are attached to either the inner or outer surface of the cell membrane. Extrinsic protein that provide mechanical support to the cell membrane that act as enzyme and have role in cell signaling. Extrinsic proteins are not embedded in the lipid bilayer, they are located on the outer or inner surface of the cell membrane, usually bound to exposed regions of integral proteins by non-covalent interactions. So, extrinsic proteins are attached to the cell membrane by weak molecular attractions like ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds or van der Waals bonds. Intrinsic protein, that is also known as integral protein. Intrinsic protein, it is embedded in the bilayer from outside to inside. So, this is intrinsic protein that is embedded in phospholipid bilayer, and this is extrinsic protein that is present here in the inner layer, it might be present in the outer layer. Integral proteins are firmly bound to the membrane. Intrinsic proteins are maybe channel proteins or carrier proteins. Now, what are channel proteins? Channel proteins, they form open water filled tubes to allow water soluble ions to diffuse across the membrane. So, this is a channel protein, it has a small opening and through this opening water soluble ions and molecules they can move outside to inside or inside to outside. Most of the communication between the interior and exterior of cell that occurs through these channels, and some of these channels are called gated because they can open or close to regulate the passage of materials. Carrier proteins that bind to molecules such as glucose and amino acid, and then they change shape in order to move these molecules across the membrane. Integral proteins may function as catalysts or receptor sites or in cell to cell recognition. So, these membrane proteins act as enzymes that catalyze reactions near the cell surface, like in mitochondrial and chloroplast membrane. These enzymes they catalyze series of reactions in cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Some of the membrane proteins they act as receptors that receive information from other cells in the form of chemical or electrical signals. Some membrane proteins they serve as identification tags that other cells recognize them. When cells recognize one another, they connect to form tissues. The proteins of the plasma membrane are generally responsible for a cell's ability to interact to the environment. Cholesterol molecule is one of the structural component of cell membrane, and that's present in phospholipid bilayer. They have hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails. They prevent close packing when the temperature decreases and prevent excessive movement when temperature increases. So, it regulates the fluidity of membranes. Glycolipid, that's another structural component where the carbohydrate is covalently bonded to a phospholipid, that is called glycolipid. As we can see in this slide, This is the carbohydrate molecule that is covalently bonded to a phospholipid molecule. It is known as glycolipid molecule. So, glycolipid is one of the structural component of cell membrane. So, this is the carbohydrate portion which extends from the phospholipid into the watery environment outside the cell. Glycoproteins, a carbohydrate is covalently bonded with a protein on the outer surface of cell membrane, that is known as glycoprotein, and it is a recognition site for hormones and neurotransmitters. As we can see in this slide, where the carbohydrate component is covalently bonded with protein molecule to form a glycoprotein, and this glycoprotein, it acts as receptor. Reception is the process of receiving an incoming signal. For example, insulin binds to insulin receptors, which are transmembrane proteins. Receptor proteins, they induce changes within the cell when they come in contact with specific molecules in the environment, such as hormones or with the molecules on the surface of neighboring cells. These molecules can function as markers that identify the cell as a particular type. What is fluid mosaic model? The way in which various molecules, now what are various molecules? These are the molecules which are present in the cell membrane. Like the cell membrane, it is composed of phospholipid bilayer with embedded protein, that is extrinsic protein and intrinsic protein. It also contains cholesterol. There is glycoprotein and glycolipid. So, glycolipid, glycoprotein, cholesterol, extrinsic protein, intrinsic protein and phospholipid bilayer, that is the composition of the cell membrane. The way in which all various molecules are combined into the structure of a cell surface membrane, that is known as fluid mosaic model. So, individual phospholipid and protein molecules, they can move relative to one another. This gives the membrane a flexible membrane structure that is constantly changing in its shape. The protein molecules, they move within the phospholipid bilayer, and protein differ in shape, size and distribution pattern. The word mosaic, it describes the pattern produced by the scattered protein molecules when the surface of the membrane is viewed from the above. Let us watch this simulation showing the fluidity of the phospholipid bilayer in the membrane allows the protein to move. Biological membranes are complex dynamic structures made up of lipid and protein molecules that are in constant motion. The properties of membrane allow them to perform many vital functions. Membrane fusion is one of the important cell process. When a vesicle fuses with the cell membrane, now both membrane compartments become continuous. Various transport vesicles that emerge from rough endoplasmic reticulum as well as from Golgi apparatus, they are responsible to transport materials from one compartment to another compartment within a cell. So, a vesicle fuses with the plasma membrane when the products are secreted from the cell during exocytosis. Cell membrane that regulate the passage of materials, and a cell is divided into compartments like mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi complex, vacuole. So, all these compartments are made up of membranes, and cell membrane, it provides a surface for chemical reactions and transmits signals between the environment and the interior of the cell. Plasma membrane of the cells that specialize in absorption fold into finger-like projections, that is called microvilli. Microvillus is singular. Microvilli, they are microscopic cellular membrane protrusions that increase the surface area for absorption of digested food. Such cells typically line in the small intestine the organ that absorbs nutrients from the digested food. Waste such as carbon dioxide and ammonia also leave the cell passing through the plasma membrane. Transport proteins help molecules and ions move across the cell membrane either from outside to the interior of the cell or vice versa. Let's watch this simulation that every living cell must have materials transported into and out of it. Mammalian red blood cells have only plasma membrane and no internal membrane compartments. To sum up, every cell is surrounded by a plasma membrane, either it's prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell. Composition of the cell membrane is concerned. Cell membrane, it is composed of phospholipid bilayer with extrinsic protein, intrinsic protein, cholesterol, glycoproteins and glycolipids. Fluid mosaic model, the way in which all the various molecules like phospholipid, bilayer, proteins, cholesterol, glycoproteins and glycolipids are combined into a structure of cell surface membrane that is known as fluid mosaic model. Functions of the cell membrane are concerned: cell membrane that's responsible to regulate the passage of materials that divide the cell into compartments. It serves as a surface for chemical reactions, like in case of mitochondrial and chloroplast membranes. Enzymes, they catalyze a series of reactions in cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And cell membrane has transmit signals between the environment and the interior of the cell. Let's watch this slideshow to revise the composition of the cell membrane.